Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harold Mock. I'm the director of Georgia College's leadership programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual forum with Dr. Rae André, Professor Emeritus at Northeastern University and author of Lead for the Planet, 5 Practices for Confronting Climate Change. Before we begin, I must say this virtual forum will be recorded. By participating in this program, you are consenting to being recorded. If you would prefer to view the recording instead of participating, please leave this meeting and email leadership.programs@gcsu.edu. Likewise, please turn off your video and ensure that you are muted. That makes for a better experience for those with limited bandwidth, and we will ask for you to rejoin at the end. We're delighted to welcome Dr. André to Georgia College to speak in our Inspire Forum on Leadership. My colleague, Michael Stratton, will introduce our distinguished guest momentarily, but allow me briefly to say a few words about this event and leadership. Georgia College is a proud and excellent liberal arts college, like Dr. André's institution, Northeastern University, and many others joining the conversation this afternoon. And the single biggest differentiator between a liberal arts college like Georgia College and other institutions is our mission to prepare students for citizenship in a free society. We don't just teach students the skills they need to get jobs. We prepare them for fulfilling lives as citizen leaders in a democratic society. Our belief is that regardless of where life's journey takes you, a liberal arts education will prepare you for a fulfilling life of citizenship, leadership, and service. Good and effective leadership is needed in all sectors of society. Students, leadership doesn't depend on your major. We need teachers and nurses and entrepreneurs and scientists and public servants, nonprofit directors, all with good leadership skills and the ability to create positive change in the world. As Dr. André will show us this evening, facing the challenges of this century will require all of us practicing good skills of leadership and citizenship, working together. And on that note, students, we're especially excited to have you here and to learn with you this evening. I encourage you to think deeply about Dr. André's message and consider how what you're studying in your classes, learning in your internships, and seeing in the world around you intersect with what we hear this afternoon. One of the most important elements of these events is that we hear from you, our students and guests. We'll have an opportunity for questions, and I encourage you to shape our conversation by asking good questions of Dr. André. Please put those questions in the chat at any point during our conversation. We're being joined this afternoon by guests from across the country, from far away as Maine and California, Texas, and Alberta. We're grateful to our 2 co-sponsors, the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges and the Management and Organizational Behavior Teaching Society. Thank you all for being here and for participating. And now my colleague, Dr. Michael Stratton, will introduce our distinguished guest.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. Good meeting. Greetings, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all for taking time to join us this evening. I'm Michael Stratton, the Dean of the J. Whitney Bunting College of Business here at Georgia College, and also current president of the Management and Organizational Behavior Teaching Society, a partner for the events this week, and a global organization dedicated to advancing teaching and learning in the management and organization disciplines. I also want to thank and welcome fellow teachers, scholars, staff, and students from COPLAC, sister institutions. We approached both MOBTS and COPLAC to join us in hosting Dr. Rae André, given the intersection of our respective organizations' values for multi and interdisciplinary teaching and learning in pursuit of the public good. And it's a distinct pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Rae André. I've had the pleasure of calling Dr. André a colleague and a friend for almost the last decade through our work together in MOBTS. She continues to be a leader in the field, advocating for meaningful, intentional, and innovative pedagogies with focused attention on teaching climate leadership. And as such, she is inspiring educators in the social sciences to develop such a course in their respective institutions. And tomorrow, she'll walk us through how to adapt or develop courses with a focus on sustainability and climate. So if you're interested and available, please please do consider attending her workshop tomorrow at 12 Eastern. Dr. André is a passionate advocate for organizations and leaders across sectors taking responsibility for engaging in the complex work of policymaking, truth-seeking and interpreting, and finding commonality to protect the planet. I've learned from Dr. André firsthand that leaders in all organizations, regardless of mission, sector, or industry, can and should take into account environmental considerations when making decisions. It shouldn't be an afterthought. In addition to being past president of MOBTS from 2010 to 2013, and recently honored as an MOBTS fellow, as Dr. Mock mentioned, she's Professor Emeritus of Leadership and Sustainability and instructor in the DeMoore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University in Boston. As a best-selling author in practice and in the academy, Dr. André has influenced a generation of students, leaders, and faculty with her numerous books published by HarperCollins, Sage, and Prentice Hall, among others, reaching fields from psychology and sociology to public policy management and leadership. Her articles have been published in Harvard Business Review Case Studies, Nonprofit Quarterly, Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Management Education, and the Management International Review, just to name a few outlets. And as Dr. Mark mentioned, her recent work, Lead for the Planet, 5 Practices for Confronting Climate Change, will be the focus of her talk this evening. Dr. André continues to have considerable influence on multiple fields and disciplines, and also on individuals for whom she's inspired to lead in this area. And with that, I'm deeply honored to welcome Dr. André to the virtual stage here at Georgia College.
Thank you so much, Michael and Harold. This has been really so much fun to set this up with you folks, and all the folks that helped. I want to thank you so much. So I'm going to jump right into my main message with you this evening, which is that Team Humanity needs to act fast to minimize global warming. By way of how I'm going to present, I'm sometimes going to read from the slides directly for emphasis. Other times I'm going to just let you guys peruse the slides to see what might be of interest to you there. So we all pretty much know that we have a very short time to address global warming. We've got to get acting now. And we need all the leaders that we can get, and they need to be prepared. You can't just jump in even from a particular specialty and say, now I'm going to address climate change. You need to know something. I've been teaching climate change and leadership and sustainability in business schools for over 10 years now. And during that time, I developed the 5 practices model. My goal has been to simplify what you need to know and put it in one place. Not that I can cover every topic thoroughly, but if you do take a look at my book, you will find a compilation of the kinds of knowledge you need to have put in a logical sequence that I'll go over shortly, so that it's of most use to you. You read this book and you will understand the climate problem vis-a-vis energy in particular, and you will be able to begin to organize your own thinking about that problem. So often today we're bombarded with the details of climate change, mostly bad. But increasingly, in terms of change, getting better. But it's hard to assimilate that unless you've already got some kind of structure in your mind about what to do with that. So we need all the leaders we can get. We have to acknowledge our strengths and weaknesses as decision makers. I'm an organizational psychologist, and I'm interested in all levels of change, from the personal to the systemic. So we need to think of ourselves as Team Humanity, all of us pulling together here on the planet, but every team, as you all know, has its strengths and weaknesses. We want to build to our strengths and minimize our weaknesses as decision makers. My specialty and my contribution in the area of change is the social science. What do we know about the social science of change as it affects this topic of global warming and energy? I'm going to, because of the social science, I'm going to build this case for you soon. I believe we should place more bets on our talents as competitors and grow private and public support for innovation, as opposed to keep beating we've got to cooperate better. And again, I'll lay that case out for you as a thesis, and I hope you'll have some discussion and questions about that. So the agenda for this evening is to lay out the 5 practices model, tell you about the social science, and work with that thesis. So I urge you to look around you and take a look at everything that's around you, and maybe put in the chat that Dr. Mock is monitoring for us. What is there anything that you see around you that was not either made of oil and or fossil fuels, but let's just focus on oil, or by a process that used oil? Is there anything out there? Put it in the chat. Let's see, and maybe the chat will stay blank. I have a very good idea that it might.
We're getting some good answers, Dr. Andre.
Like what? What do you got there?
Professor El-Jarbagi says, my office plants with a question mark. She says, me with a question mark.
Okay.
Molly says her cat. Dr. Causey points out, he says trees.
Okay. All right. Okay, we got it. But you're looking around at all the things in your life, and they're heavily dependent on oil. We live in the age of oil. Often we refer to it as the Industrial Revolution, but guess what? The Industrial Revolution didn't happen unless we had different and new and better kinds of energy. And we love it. We love to live this way. We don't want to have to go card the wool from our sheep and knit our sweaters. We're done with that. We want to move on. But moving on, burning the fossil fuels that we've done over the last 150 years has created problems like this. This is Hurricane Florence. Maybe even some of you were affected by Hurricane Florence, which was a very intense hurricane that dropped a lot of water, in particular, very slow moving over the southeast of the United States just a couple of years ago. It also creates problems like fire. This is a satellite picture of the fires in California last year and the 1,200-mile plume of smoke that it sent inland. Terrible devastation in the state of California. And this is, of course, the polar vortex that will get you if you don't watch out. So as a Team Humanity's goals are to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We can still do that. Create a clean energy future. Wouldn't that be brilliant? And do it through democratic processes. For the moment, I just want to emphasize through democratic processes because, in fact, I'm not going to talk about that a lot, but it still is extremely important. If that's all you do the rest of your life is improve our democratic processes and never touch climate change, you will still have fostered climate change mitigation and help. So, I use the word practices, 5 practices of climate leaders, and I want to give you a definition of that. A practice is to learn a set of facts, theories, and strategies, and then apply these to drive policies, plans, and actions to our goals. So it's a very broad set of ideas put into 5 buckets that I'm going to describe. And it emphasizes our particular view on practices is that we use social science, but not just social science and informed reasoning to help guide our decisions. If we focus just on what we know through social science, we won't know enough to solve the problem. So the logic of the 5 practices is first, get the truth. What does truth mean to you? Where does your own truth come from? Then assess the risks. When you see problems, how do you react to those problems, whether you're in an organization or whether you're as an individual? Then you have to weigh the stakes. Who's at risk here? Companies, countries, people. What are their stakes? And who are the major stakeholders in this realm? This is a very complicated question, but a crucial question. Then you also have to define the business of business. Now, I'm a business professor. I went into business professoring after working for 3 Fortune 100 companies because as a kid, I was fascinated by business, in part because they wouldn't let girls do business back in the day. So I kind of got interested. And business is at the core of what is happening in terms of turning raw materials into products, and in the process creating carbon dioxide that is polluting our atmosphere. So we need to understand how business does this. And in fact, what is your role if you're working in a business, and many of you will work in businesses? What is your role within a business to help improve, address climate change? And then finally, engage global leadership. No one business can do this alone. There has to be some kind of engagement with the world. And how is that working? So that's the logic of the 5 practices model, from the micro to the macro. So I'm going to go briefly through each of the 5 practices. Please take a look at these slides. I won't mention every single thing that's on it, but this is just a glance at what is in the chapter. So it's important for each of us to understand where our truth does come from, and to understand that from a micro aspect. We perceive truth both intellectually and emotionally. And we also perceive truth because we look at certain media, which is a macro factor. So when you understand where your own truth comes from, it's much easier for you to understand where other people's truth comes from, so that you can have some sort of a dialogue with folks who come from a different background. It's very important for you to understand how to read science, and to understand how the science is going to play out in your life and in the organizations in which you'll be working. So as we go along here, I'm going to ask you some questions to engage you just a bit on some of these issues. So if you were taking a course from me, I would give you some stuff to read about the state of the planet, and then I'd give you a quiz. And this would be the kind of question that I might ask you in a quiz. So the average global temperature on Earth has increased by somewhat more than 1 Celsius in Fahrenheit. Sorry, how much is that in Fahrenheit? So you can put your answers in the chat. Be brave. The chat is not public, I believe. Is that right, Dr. Mock?
They can send it to me directly, and it won't be public, or they can send it to everyone if they're feeling very bold.
Okay, perfect, perfect. What kind of answers do we have?
33, lots of 33.8 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes, Americans all, yes. Okay, moving on. Does anybody have it right? Do you know the right answer?
They're Googling.
No, fair to Google. It's not fair to Google. Okay. So you want to be a good reader of science, and even popular science. So when you read 1 degree Celsius and that the Earth's temperature has increased 1 degree Celsius, as an American, maybe you're going to skip over that because you don't really understand what that is, or you're going to try to apply a formula to it, and you're going to try to understand it. Now, the correct answer is 1 degree in Celsius is 1.8 degree in Fahrenheit. So now, does the world feel warmer to you now? Your perception of the truth here depends on whether you think in Fahrenheit or in Celsius. And I'm not going to go through the details of this formula here, but we all remember the 9/5 plus 32, but we're really looking at degrees here, not scales. You can look at this again some other time if you didn't quite get it the first time. Okay, here's another one. This is even more detailed with respect to climate change. An energy company has just discovered a shale play that may yield 3 billion barrels of oil. Shale play means a place in, in shale industry parlance. At current pre-COVID rates of world consumption, how long will this much oil last the world? No Googling, no Googling, no Googling. Okay, any guesses, Dr. Ma?
Oh, we've got some traffic here. So Lily tells us 1 day. Emma says 1 week, Dr. Andre. Michael Mills says 25 years. We've got 6 months. So we're ranging from a day to 25 years, Dr. André.
Is there anybody that really thinks they know? No, I didn't hear it. I didn't hear the right answer yet. Okay. So it's really important when you're reading along and you see, wow, they found 30 billion barrels of oil. You are likely, because that's a big number, to go, oh, wow, that's a lot. We've got lots of oil left in the world. But in fact, here's the right answer. The world uses about 100 million barrels of oil every day. It's blah, 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 do the division. And so 3 billion barrels only last 30 days. So I was really pleased to hear at one point when several of the states in the southeastern part of our country were considering allowing offshore drilling for some oil that's apparently available off the shore of the southeastern United States. And some public official said, I'll be darned if I'm going to allow us to lose our beaches for X amount of oil that's only going to last, you know, whatever it was, 3 months or something. What a great way to reason. That guy got it. And I presume that every, state official gets it, but I'm not so sure. You now get it. So pay attention next time somebody tries to bamboozle you with the billions of barrels of oil that are left. Okay, practice 2 is to assess the risk. So you need to understand the psychology of risk. You need to understand how the risk is perceived by global organizations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations organization that is telling us so much about the risks of the planet. And you need to know a lot about how people make decisions on managing risk. So let's just take a look at a few of the risks that are out there. Here's one. The climate is changing at a pace that's far faster than anything seen in blank years. You can put a letter in the chat. Let's see what we get. Notice it's changing at a pace that's far faster, a pace. We're looking at the pace of change. This is pretty easy because I wrote this and it's not all that intransparent. Okay. What did you get, Dr. Mark? Any B's?
B, 65,000 years.
Yeah, okay, it's A, 65 million years. Okay, they study ice cores and they figure that out. Throughout history, until about 200 years ago, the Earth's atmosphere contained 270 parts per million of carbon dioxide. What do scientists believe to be the safe upper limit for CO2 in our atmosphere? In other words, the number beyond which it's, global warming is upon us and we're in big trouble.
We have gotten nearly every answer. We've gotten A through D. We've got a couple of votes for C. Most of our votes are now for C, Dr. André.
Okay, good. So 350 has penetrated the public consciousness. The right answer is 350 parts per million. Okay, so another question: where are temperatures increasing the most?
Almost unanimously D, Dr. André, at the polls.
Excellent. That's the best group.
That was unanimous. That was unanimous.
Oh, wonderful. At the polls. Excellent. A lot of people don't get that. And so there is some education going on out there. I'm very pleased to hear. Okay, so we're considering here risk and how you feel about these numbers, and also what you know about these numbers. It's important for all of us to have some basic education about climate change. I do not offer that basic education. You can get that a lot somewhere else. What I do is go beyond that climate change education to talk about how we're going to get things done, how we're going to create change for this. One of the things that people tell me and that I experience personally is that it's a pain in the neck to try to stay on top of what's happening with regard to climate change because so many different things are happening. I recommend you bookmark this somehow, the Keeling curve. And, once a year, you look at the Keeling curve, you'll know where we are. You don't have to look any more than once a year. As you can see, the proportion or the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has been steadily ascending since 1960. You might think, well, in 2020, because of COVID, it went down. It did go down a little bit, but one of those upticks went down 6%. And people are predicting that the next year it's going to go right back up again. So take a look at the Keeling curve, understand the Keeling curve, and use that as your primary measure of the overall impact of burning fossil fuels in the world. If you now want to look at where the Keeling curve falls on the historic measure of amount of CO2, you can, if you look at this, does that make you feel nervous, afraid? Is that risky? I'd say, yeah, that's pretty risky. But that's something that you can discuss in your science classes to understand that fully. So what's so urgent is that scientists are predicting that at 450 parts per million, the global temperature will likely reach 2 degrees Celsius. How much is that in Fahrenheit, everybody? 1.8 times 2. In February of this year, we already reached 416, and we're estimated target date is 2037, and this is bad news for the planet. Okay, so what are the stakes that different people have? This slide is very simple, in part because it's so hard to relay what is in this chapter. But we're going to look at business, we're going to look at government, we're going to look at the difference between regulation and free market, and way business's predominant impact. So one of the things about impact is that when you look at stakes, you have to look at regions, because the impact is going to be different in different regions. So I just bring this one in because I know many of you have been to Europe or would love to go to Europe. It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. And let's just think about some of the regional differences between what's happening to the climate in Europe versus, for example, here. So Paris is on the same latitude as what city on the eastern coast of North America? And why does that matter? You can put that in the chat. Don't Google it. And while you're doing that, I should say that actually in class, we Google all the time in class, right? Just the phones are on, because there's, every time I type a letter, meaning a single letter on my keyboard, the numbers in front of us have already changed. So we have to do our best to stay on top of them. Writing a book is an act of faith in this market.
We've got some good guesses here, or maybe they're not guesses. We have DC, Chicago, Boston, your town there, Dr. Andre, Boston, Toronto. One person said, 2 people say New York.
Okay. So here you go. Here's Paris. And the answer is St. John, Newfoundland. Ooh. Right. Okay. So did anybody describe why that matters?
No, and no one guessed St. John.
No, we wouldn't even necessarily know St. John unless I put it up there. So here's why. So this here is the North Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And it brings warm water from the Gulf of Mexico over to Europe and keeps Europe warm. Okay. Now, Europe is, some people would argue, quite ahead of us in terms of addressing climate change. And certainly the UK is an outstanding example of some of the things that can be done. So these currents go all over the world, but let's just think about this one and the regional importance of that. So scientists are now telling us that the AMOC is slowing, and it's slowing, it's increasingly slower. So if you're in Europe and you are counting on that current to keep you warm, to have palm trees in England, for example, you are worried. And here's another related water example. This shows in our country, a different region, how the Great Lakes are warming. Here's the 2021 warming pattern of the Great Lakes, and showing how soon they will the ice cover is melting. So always when you're thinking of stakeholders, you have to think of region. And so as you guys go out into your careers, you want to be thinking, you want general knowledge, but you also want to focus on understanding what's happening exactly where you are and where your family and your companies are. Here's one that's, I don't want to take the time to, but it's very interesting to do, and I think very important because it affects all of us, and that is the Arctic Ocean is melting in the summers. And some people say that by 2050, it will be open, it will be ice-free. So that means that travel can occur through the Arctic in the summers in the future, that maybe some oil is available up there. It's extremely difficult to extract under the ice, and it's very deep. I don't know if it's going to be feasible to even get to it, but nevertheless, the Arctic is very important, and that one you can look up, guys. Look that up. There are half a dozen countries that are on the Arctic Ocean, and you should be able to kind of look down from a bird's eye view and imagine that as you think about different regions of the world. Okay, practice 4 is define the business of business. Are businesses pursuing weak sustainability or strong sustainability? What about business schools? Well, weak sustainability is sustainability for your organization. Strong sustainability is sustainability for the planet. I urge you, young people, to think about finding a cultural fit with your company, if at all possible, no matter what your walk of life. If you believe that we need strong sustainability and you're in a company that is practicing weak sustainability and not trying to do better, I'm going to suggest you're going to burn out and it's going to be hard on you. So look for that and see if you can find it. What percentage of business schools are teaching strong sustainability? I have to say very few. The strong sustainability paradigm is this. Nancy Landrum at Loyola Chicago has been doing a lot of work on strong and weak sustainability. In one sample, only 29% used readings based on strong sustainability. And I would say most people who are interested in having me talk are either international, that is non-American, or they're in religious schools or mission-oriented schools or liberal arts schools. Very seldom do business schools invite me. I'm hoping that'll change, but we'll see. So finally, engaging global leadership. We need to learn about what we can do to affect climate change. In general, are we doing enough to improve on our ability to cooperate, but also move towards something that works with a different part of who we are, which is to enjoy competition. Success is going to require a plan. Not to go into this too much, but the Paris Accords get people talking, but they're not a plan. And the danger is that people think it really is a plan, but it doesn't. It is not. A plan has all these attributes, and including an accountability strategy and leadership. And not to say that Paris doesn't have leadership. It has excellent leadership, but it is still not a plan. It's not, people are not beholding to their goals in Paris. And a lot of people have made that criticism. Some people that have put out plans are David McKay, the late David McKay in Britain. You can see that free online. A very interesting thing to do in your courses is to work with the En-ROAD simulation, which is a plan out of MIT. The best one that I have seen. At the same time, MIT is working on a whole bunch of plans that add up to change that will actually save the planet, as opposed to just talk about saving the planet. Okay, so given time, I'm just going to rush right on here and talk about what I found in the social sciences in the 5 practices. So again, I'm on the one hand, I'm finding things and organizing things in such a way that students can learn a particular set of information. And I'm bolstering that with whatever social science I could find that related to climate change in that area. And what I want to do is tell you what social scientists have found in each of these areas. In general, I tried to find the most important social scientists, the ones that have worked in the area for maybe a lifetime, or have done a very important study or written a book that summarizes their beliefs. So this kind of social science can help us to estimate probabilities. For example, we know from En-ROAD simulation and other places that putting a price on carbon is the best way to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. Will our states put a price on carbon? Will Massachusetts put a price on carbon? Social science can help us to estimate those probabilities. The thesis that I have is that based on the social science is that cooperation is not likely to be strong enough. It's not likely to be fast enough. Where does this come from? Now, you'll forgive me. I am going to read some of this for emphasis. So Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics as a psychologist, working on how people make decisions from a micro point of view, from the workings of the brain, and some behavioral studies aligned with that. So when what he says, I am deeply pessimistic. I really see no path to success on climate change. And then he would say things like, you know, we think too short term. We're too oriented to short-term problems, that sort of thing. Again, all this is in the book. It's there for you to see. Daniel Gilbert, well-known, a famous, popular cognitive psychologist at Harvard, says of the climate problem, a psychologist could barely dream up a better scenario for paralysis. Oops. These guys, Carnevale and Probst, in this very interesting book on climate and organizations, decide that, or deduce that whereas humans may have evolved the intuition to cooperate. So we're kind of getting there. It is unlikely such intuition brings world peace closer. It's not strong enough yet. Charles Hexer, a specialist in trust, and written this very interesting book, we are not likely to be able to get the nations of the world to work together on climate change or the reduction of inequality. Neither the needed attitude nor the skills are widely enough distributed. Fascinating book on rationing. How self-sacrificing are we in the modern day? Cox looked back over how we rationed during the Second World War, for example. And one of the people he quotes says, we have to reckon with the fact that from 1947, the end of the Second World War, to 2008, we had a collision with affluence, we Americans of the world. And it changed us as a people. It changed our political expectations. It changed us morally, and we lost a sense of discipline. Try to impose a carbon tax, let alone rationing today. Oops, sorry. I just can't see what that says there because I've got a little panel over it. You'll hear moaning and groaning from all over. Global governance, these fascinating recent book on policy. Summary down here at the bottom. There will be a rocky road ahead, and the stakes are whose way of life gets to survive. Cooperation problems continue to stymie effective global climate governance. And they looked at a whole bunch of different organizations that are working on that, basically saying cooperation ain't working, folks. Jared Diamond, the famous geographer, looked at how societies collapse all over the world, and he concluded that many of them, if not all, the major collapses are because of resource depletion. So if we believe that Team Humanity's weak on cooperation, the challenge for leaders is, to persuade people that they have to sacrifice in the present, to help people let go of tribalism, and to develop plans that add up and therefore motivate everyone. But those social scientists are not all that bullish on it. The good news is that cooperation is not just what we're about. We're also about competitive creativity, being adventurous, assertive, innovative. And so I think what we have to stop doing is having a knee-jerk reaction to a problem which says, oh, we got to cooperate more. We've got to get the government to take care of this. No, no, no. We also have to think very hard about how our scientists and our entrepreneurs, our risk takers, and the governments that support them can move to innovation. There's a really fascinating company out there sponsored by Bill Gates and his group called Heliogen. Their new technology could remove the CO2 from cement production by 40% if it can be scaled up. Cement, if it were a country, a polluting country, would be the third most polluting country in the world. And as we move to a more urban society, we're going to need plenty of cement to make those cities. So this is the kind of innovation that I'm talking about that can really solve problems well and on a large scale. To follow up on that, I am not an expert in innovation. My work kind of stops here. I'm just kind of looking over the wall and saying, oops, over there might be a solution. But I do think there's a lot of sense to building a constituency for R&D and deploy, and the second D, which is deployment. And some entrees to that for you are, first of all, Bill Gates has just published a book that makes this argument, and in some ways, I see it as Bill Gates' Hail Mary, which is, we got to get this done, guys. We need to invest in R&D now. And another really great place to see what's actually happening is the MIT Energy Initiative, which you can find online and sign up for their various updates. So I want to thank you very much. And I am available at raeandré.com. You can contact me there. There's also published on my first page of my website a guide for community discussions if you want to discuss this particular book in your community. There are teaching materials, an article about how to teach this material, a handbook that shows you some of the supplementary exercises and things that I do. And there's also my blog, Climate Leadership Now, which periodically I update with new thoughts and new information, and just try to be of interest. One of the things that's of interest there is a climate change manifesto for university students. I think university students, in part, have to take the leadership to prompt their schools to help us not to look at how we change the world in order to solve the climate problem. So thank you. And now we open up to questions.
That's right. Thank you, Dr. André. And I would encourage those of us who have questions, please put them in the chat. We have an opportunity now to either ask questions following up on things that Dr. André has said, or questions maybe related to climate change and her work generally. So please put those in the chat. I'll share. I'll get us started. Our first question for you, Dr. André, is what is the most surprising and or worrying climate change denial argument you have encountered, and how did you reply?
That's a really hard question, in part because when people come to me with, and they rarely do, honestly, and saying, I don't believe in climate change, I have to refer them to the science and talk to that person individually about what they might not understand about the science. I think you first have to just figure out whether the person even cares about science, because if they don't care about science, I can't change that point of view. So it's not as though I've had 10 people come to me and say, I don't believe this. Everybody believes it in my part of the world, my intellectual part of the world. So, that really is, that's how I address that.
There's a second question on a sort of a similar note. It is, how can we overcome the denial, doubt, and deflection that corporations have engaged in for the past 40 years? And in turn, how can corporations move beyond denial, doubt, and deflection? And you address that in your book, The Business of Business. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about that.
Well, very complicated question again. Well, you guys ask these really Yeah, very hard questions. You know, I think that in the last, let's see, 15 years, there's been an explosion of belief in climate change and the problems it's going to cause. Up until that time, it felt a little bit more like a minor strategic issue that companies could deflect. And so I think companies as and also like individuals are on learning curves about what to do. Certainly, it is true that certain oil companies in the past have denied climate change and tried to change the conversation in a different direction and say, you know, it's fake, and they should be held accountable for that. For example, when they're responsible for telling the truth to their shareholders and they don't tell them the truth, they should be held for that, accountable for that. But going forward, we're going to need all hands on deck. We're going to need business and government. And some of our best friends may turn out to be energy companies who are now fossil fuel companies and see the writing on the wall and have the money to invest in new technologies and the buildup of new technologies. So I think we need to work with that innovation, that innovation piece that my work kind of stops there. It points to the innovation piece, but it doesn't, in a sophisticated way, address the innovation piece.
This question is for me, but it is a follow-up on that very note of innovation. There seems to be in the private sector, I'd say maybe over the past, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, a kind of competing impulse. One is maybe to shout against the wind and you know, do everything possible to maintain the status quo. But why is innovation not more widely adopted? Capitalism thrives in innovation and competition. What is the challenge, I suppose, in private sector organizations maybe you've worked with or you've studied in embracing maybe a more diversified or innovative approach and moving away from a fossil fuel-based industry or economy?
Again, what I know about innovation, there are different steps in innovation. Okay, so you could create something brilliant, but if nobody's willing to invest in it, and that's where the financial side comes in and the governmental side comes in. If nobody's willing to invest on it, it's just going to be put on some back shelf somewhere, and it's never going to come to fruition. So there are stages of innovation, and at each stage there are key problems. And one is, for example, that Bill Gates, when he started his investment company group 12 years ago or so, he had to look for people who had enough money that they could invest it and not care about whether it was going to pay off for 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 years, right? They really, people with big money that didn't need a payout from it. And it's hard to find that money. A lot of investors can't afford to hold on that long. So therefore, you know, at a certain stage of innovation, a product doesn't come to fruition because of that factor. Another factor is when you want to roll something out, usually some of these innovations are very expensive relatively. For example, people are trying to put solar now on essentially material. So you could lay it up on your window and have solar panels on your window instead of on, you know, some heavy, nasty thing on your house, but on your roof. But that's more expensive right now. Now, one of the ways that government can help is to be, because it's a big buyer, a customer, it can support such technologies by buying them and actually using them, and therefore helping to bring the price down so the average business or consumer can use it. So in all those stages, there are problems to be solved, and leadership is needed. Some of you folks are scientists and you work on that side of it, but generally smart scientists, as far as I understand, again, I'm not an expert in this, but smart scientists partner with a smart entrepreneur who is doing the business side of bringing this to the market. I can't answer your question fully, Dr. Mock, but I hope that you want to follow up or.
Well, I have a follow-up here from, we have quite a few questions here, a good follow-up from Dr. Causey, and he says, since capitalism got us into this mess, that is industrialism, and since capitalism is premised on the illusion of unlimited growth and resources, why should we believe that capitalism will get us out of this mess? He says, it seems to me that we need a fundamental paradigm shift in our thinking about our relationship to nature, one that avoids, for example, speaking of nature as a resource or capital. Do you have a response to that, Dr. André?
Well, I totally agree in terms that we have to think of nature in as not as something that can be exploited, but we have to have circular economies that, to the extent possible, where we take from nature, we make from nature, and we give back to nature in equivalence. Now, that's almost impossible to do, but we can do it a whole lot better than we are doing. But when I get a little bit, what's the word? I worry when people start saying capitalism is bad because it's such a broad term. I think what's really bad or weak is our ability to regulate capitalism. I'm for regulated capitalism, and that's why I mentioned at the earlier part of my presentation that we have to do this through democracy. And it's through having a strong democracy in which values like preservation of nature are maintained that we can create reasonable regulations that everyone can work with. I remember I was at a conference in India at one point, speaking to a coal mogul there and talking to him about, what can we do about this? Obviously coal is one of the most polluting things, and it's continued to be burned, especially in India and China. And although, he didn't say that he was willing to give up his companies, he did say, I'm a competitor. I can compete in any system that's regulated. Just regulate it and make it an even playing field. And I'm very happy to compete there. And I think that's what we need to do, is to regulate in such a way that there is an even playing field for, let's say, fossil fuels and green energy. Right now, we subsidize fossil fuels enormously, and green energy less so. And innovation is something like, I don't know, Bill Gates is arguing, I think it is, that he wants 5 times as much R&D money from the government and private capital, I think. But internationally, the R&D funds have gone down tremendously in recent years. So we can't do this without business.
Right.
And business is subject to the bottom line and subject to the fact that, Joe Schmo and then, the next town over might not have the same regulatory regimen that I have. So then I can't compete. So then people, so then you have to have cross-border taxes and tariffs, which the EU is considering right now for us. And we're kind of pushing back and saying, no, please don't do that.
Yeah. On that note, we have about 3 or 4 questions here that I'd like to paraphrase into kind of a scenario. Let's say that you were called up by the CEO or a board chair of a large privately held company, and they said, "We're interested in your work. What would you have us do?" What would you tell that board about how to adapt their business practices?
Who are you?
I would be the board chair of a privately held firm.
Are you talking to me? What would I do?
What would you do? What would you have us do?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm gonna go back to, you have to know your company, you have to know your business, you have to know your competitors, you have to know your government.
Yeah.
And certainly establishing, pushing the government to regulate fairly it helps business a lot.
And I ask that in part recognizing that part of the argument you lay out in your book, or a significant portion of the argument, is that no one sector, organization, or group can accomplish these things independently of the others. Your immediate answer to me, playing a sort of as a businessman, is to say you have to operate in a predictably regulated environment. Correct?
They prefer to do that. Many do, some don't. That's another factor. That's a major factor, in fact.
An additional question we have, are you familiar, this is a question for you, are you familiar with the work of John Englander, who wrote High Tide on Main Street? He's written about the coming coastal crisis, and his sense of urgency and his commitment seems similar to yours. Are you familiar with that work at all, or do you have a comment?
I'm not familiar with that work. Again, it's regional. I think Miami's got terrible problems. Norfolk, Virginia, in that area, not just because sea levels are rising, but because their land is sinking. So again, it's a regional issue. I'm sure it's a very interesting book.
And part of that you touch on in the book as well is a regulation in this sense cannot simply come from Washington, D.C. If we're dealing with certainly a climate crisis, but we're also dealing with independent effects around the world. So, for instance, state governments are also it's also necessary for state governments to take action. And I think there's some resources on your website to that end too about how to address institutions maybe closer to us than our elected officials in Washington.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it all has to add up, and I take you back to the McKay plan, where he looked at basically kilowatt hours and how many kilowatt hours a house uses, and then a community, and then a state, and he mostly focused, I think, on well, he did a spectrum of analysis, and that's the kind of understanding we need to have. In order to systemically and systematically both address the problem. I do think that sometimes communities get stuck in thinking about, putting in heat pumps or whatever it is to improve their or recycling when there are miraculous kinds of innovations potentially out there that they could at least support their state to be innovative, because states do have various things that they can do. They can promote innovative company communities and networks, for example. That was something that happened very successfully here in Massachusetts. And so citizens need to be aware not just of what they can do individually, but what their state is capable of doing. Mm-hmm. And states are capable of doing a whole lot. And cities also.
Dr. Otter, Doug Otter, who is a geographer, asks, what specific careers do you suggest for our students to maximize their positive impacts?
I think you can, as either you or Michael said very well at the beginning, you can address this from many, many, many different professions. I would hesitate to dictate it. Whatever you decide, be really good at it. Right?
On that note, too, I'll remind us all that most of the people in this conversation this evening are students. Dr. André, if you could go back and tell your 18 or 20-year-old self something, it may deal with climate change, it may not. What would you tell your 18 or 20-year-old self, your college-aged self?
About what?
Anything. If knowing what you know now, what advice, in other words, would you give the students on this call?
Study hard. Be aware that this is a problem. Climate change is going to be with you for the rest of your life. So it's a really good idea for you to get a basic education about that, and not just the science, but about how to address it and how the world's going to address it. that will make you a better citizen, whether in your family, in your community, or in your company.
Yeah, thank you. The last question will be from me. I wonder, aside from your book, are there certain books that you especially enjoy or that you would commend to us to read for those who are interested in some of the topics that you have addressed?
Any of the books that I mentioned in the talk they're all excellent books. I also think that may I go into blogs and whatnot. Energy Mix is a great place it's a Canadian website that will bring you news 3 times a week. It's free. They're very, very good. And I will say, one of the things that I didn't really talk about here, but Canada is our partner in this. Canada is doing so much, both positively and negatively, around climate, and you really need to understand our neighbor Canada. So start paying attention, folks up there. So Energy Mix, it comes from Canada. I also like very much the Financial Times. The Financial Times is, in my view, the best place to learn about energy. And it's unfortunately a very expensive newspaper. So, lobby your university there, your universities, to make that available to students. It's really very good. And it brings this international perspective too, that a lot of our American journals don't do so much. And then for fun and to keep ourselves sane while we do all this, there's a really fun British humor, sustainababble.fish, which takes the same attitude that I do and has the same knowledge base, which is, we're in trouble here, but we're gonna have a good time while we're facing this problem.
Great. I'd like to, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Dr. André. We, these are conversations that, of course, we hear a lot, but thinking about it in terms of leadership and citizenship, I think, is a really valuable approach, especially for so many of our students. So I want to thank you for leading this discussion. I also want to commend to all of us. I have read my copy of Lead for the Planet. It's an excellent book. It will challenge you to think of things in maybe some new ways. So I encourage you to read that. For those of us on the call who are educators, teachers, school teachers, professors, and so forth, please, if you have not already, register to join us tomorrow. Dr. André is leading a session at noon on teaching climate change, and the information is online at gcsu.edu/inspire. And finally, I want to acknowledge and thank, in addition to our presenter, Dr. André, our co-sponsors at Georgia College, certainly the College of Business and the Office of Sustainability, and likewise to thank our sponsors in the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges and the Management and Organizational Behavior Teaching Society, and folks who have joined us from across the country. So thank you all for being here and for your excellent questions of Dr. André. I encourage you to, again, to read her book, to connect with us further, and we have our material, her material linked from our webpage as well, so that you can access some of what she referenced here. So that said, I thank you all. Thank you again, Dr. André, and I wish you all a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Really, really fun.